Good afternoon. My name is Julia Thompson. I'm the Education Program Manager at the Holocaust Center for Humanity. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center's virtual space for our Lunch and Learn program today, featuring legacy speaker Steve Pruzan sharing his family story. First, let me acknowledge that the Holocaust Center for Humanity in downtown Seattle, where I am today, sits on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. The Duwamish continue to honor, practice, and share their heritage and culture, and the center strives to join them in this endeavor. If you are joining from outside Seattle, I encourage you to visit native-land.ca to learn more about the Indigenous peoples of your own town or area. The link to this informative site is in the chat. A quick announcement regarding the Holocaust Center's longtime community partner, Densho, a Seattle organization whose mission is to preserve and share history of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans to promote equity and justice today. Next month, on June 22nd, our Lunch and Learn will feature Tom Ikeda, Densho's founder and director. To get a sneak peek of one of the projects Tom is working on, tune in today at 5 p.m. to see him in conversation with Daniel James Brown, the author of The Boys in the Boat, about his new book on Japanese American incarceration, Facing the Mountain. Please visit the link in chat to learn more and register. The Holocaust Center thanks our community partners for today's Lunch and Learn: Jewish Family Service, Temple de Hirsch Sinai, and the Washington State Jewish Historical Society. Special thanks to the Tacoma Jewish Community Fund for being a Lunch and Learn sponsor this entire year. Now, let me formally introduce today's speaker. Seattle attorney Steve Pruzan is a long way from his grandparents' farm in Germany, yet he feels a deep responsibility to keep his family story alive. Steve's grandparents, Max and Helene Schlonau, owned a large farm in Varmson, Germany for generations, and it was a gathering place for many relatives. Literally on the eve of World War II's outbreak in Europe, Steve's grandparents and his mother Inga, then 15, fled Germany for the United States. In this story of discrimination, escape, strength, and rebuilding, you will meet seemingly ordinary people, like a Seattle doctor who sponsored the family's journey, and a Danish resistance fighter. Their stories intertwine with the Schlonau and Pruzan families during one of history's most dire moments. Steve grew up in Seattle, attended Claremont College, and got his JD at Gonzaga University. Steve has practiced law here for over 35 years and has been a valued member of our Speakers Bureau for about 4 years. We will be taking questions at the end today, so please add yours to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time during the hour. Steve, it's always a pleasure to work with you, and I thank you so much for spending today sharing your story with our audience. I will hand it over to you to begin your presentation.
Well, thanks, Julia. And I'm delighted to be here with you for this Lunch and Learn session to tell you my immediate and extended family's story of how they were able to flee from Germany. Thanks to all of you, students and adults alike, for attending and for your interest. This presentation is generally and primarily given to middle school and high school age students, just so you know who this is targeted to. And so now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so we're ready to begin. And so this is Fleeing Germany, my family story. My family story is a part of history, and I did not want my family's story, including the story of extended relatives, to be lost. My grandparents brought personal documents, photos, belongings, and furniture from Germany. I was lucky enough to be able to hear my grandparents' and mother's stories, as well as our relatives' stories, and to know how my cousins all and my mother and grandparents were able to escape. So using these primary sources, in addition to historical research, which was provided to me in an interesting way. Shortly after my mother died in 2010, maybe a year or so later, I was contacted by a man named Aubrey Pomerantz, who's the director of archives at the Jewish Museum of Berlin. And his job is to literally go around the world, find obituaries of German Jews who escaped the Holocaust, and meet with their families and find out their stories, and then research it and archive it. And so he did that. He came to Seattle. I met with him for many hours. He took many documents, and then he did research, or they did at the museum for a couple of years before they responded. And a big part of what we have here today was we were able to learn about through his research. And a couple of years ago, my wife Janet and I went to the Berlin Museum, and we were able to see the archives and what they had with regard to my parents, so to my mother and grandparents. And so together with that research and with a tremendous amount of research done by the Holocaust Center, we were able to create this presentation. So my grandparents lived in Warmsen, Germany. Warmsen is a small agricultural town in northern Germany with a current population of about 3,500 residents. In 1933, Warmsen was home to about 13 Jewish families, including the Schlonau family. My grandparents were Max Schlonau, who you see, of course, there on the left, and my grandmother, Helene Schlonau. My great-grandparents were Moritz Schlonau. You can see on the right upper picture there a copy or a picture of his grave. My great-grandmother, or his wife, was Emma Zeeman. My great-grandmother was Regine Nachman, and her husband was Seaman Zeeman. He had first and last name were the same. And you can see here a picture of Regine Nachman. And you also see these grave sites. And if you go to Varmson, which we did many years ago, you'll be able to see those graves. This is on the left. Stammbaum means pedigree or family tree, and this is a family tree that goes back into about the mid 1800s. On the right-hand side is notice of death for my great-grandfather Moritz Schlonau. Dem Aachen means the memory. It says meines unvergebblichen Vaters, which is my unforgettable father. And it says Ruhe friedlich, which means rest in peace. So life before World War I in Varmson was a wonderful time for my family in Varmson. My grandmother and her friends enjoyed the outdoor life, and they loved to have picnics and play the guitar. See my grandmother there with the guitar. And in the upper left picture there, you see Hans Lehmann, who was my grandmother and my mother's cousin. And Hans Lehmann is the little guy sitting there with the hat on. And you will learn as we go along here shortly that he was incredibly instrumental in the ability of our family to flee from Germany. These are some pictures that my grandparents brought from Varmson. Many of these pictures are around the turn of the century, around 1900 or shortly thereafter. And Max's life before and during World War I was that from October of 1910 to September of 1912, he was a soldier working in the Treasury Department. Then during World War I, Max served again from 1918 to 1990 as a paymaster in the regiment. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see him standing at attention in front of the cavalry that he was involved with. He was a paymaster and responsible for payment of wages and salaries. He was a very proud German and was proud at that time to serve in the army in World War I. Max was awarded the Iron Cross. The Iron Cross is the best known German military medal recognized for acts of heroism, bravery, and leadership. And you'll see that about 100,000 Jews fought for Germany in World War II. 12,000 were killed in action, and many Jewish men were decorated with the Iron Cross for their valor on the front. But of course, after World War I in 1919, and the Germans lost the war, the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June of 1919, which imposed crippling reparations on Germany. There was a global economic depression that started, and many blamed the socialists, communists, and of course the Jews. And the Jews were used as scapegoats, and anti-Semitism increased. You'll see the red arrow there on the picture, which points to a sign that says to vote for Hitler. So when Max returned to the farm in Varmson after World War I, he enlarged the farm, and he ran a very successful cattle ranch and was a well-known and important member of the community, and employed a number of different people at the farm and the ranch. In 1923, Max married my grandmother, Helene, and my mother, Inga, who you see there, was born in 1924. Family life for her was quite good early on. You'll see these pictures there. The two on the left are pictures of her when she was about 8 years old in Varmson. On the right there, you'll see some of her friends that she had, who she played with in Varmson, most of whom, of course, were not Jewish. And so here's some additional pictures that you'll see. In the top left-hand corner, you'll see my mother there with this lady who was her nanny. Her husband was the chief caretaker of the farm. They were both employed by my grandparents. And when they left Germany, they took over the house. And many years ago now, my sister and I and my parents went to Varmson. We knocked on the door of the house there, and this lady answered and saw my mother for the first time since she had left when she was 15, and it was quite an emotional reunion. You'll see those kids down below there with my mother. We were taken around the whole town of Warmsen, and these kids, who were then, of course, adults, were still living there. The people who were the bakers over the years were still baking things. The cobbler, shoe cobbler, was still the shoe cobbler. And so things didn't change much in Varmson for many centuries. Here are some additional pictures of my mother and with some of her friends from Varmson. By the mid 1930s, Max owned about 100 to 150 acres, and he employed, as I was mentioning, many farm workers to run the farm and to work the cattle ranch. And he did a lot of work himself with buying and selling of cattle, where I think he did quite well financially. But of course, starting in the 30s there and even before, there was a rise in anti-Semitism in Germany. And anti-Semitism, as we know, is the prejudice against or hatred of Jews. Now, anti-Semitism wasn't something new that came along with Hitler. It existed in Europe for hundreds of years, and there would be times when the anti-Semitism was at a much higher rate than at other times, and so it would kind of come and go. And the period of time before World War I was actually a time where it was quite good for the Jews. And so my grandparents had a good life, of course, up until the time that the Nazis took over. And the Nazis considered themselves Aryan, which is a kind of a distinct European race. Hitler wanted to preserve racial purity, and the Jews were considered to be a threat to that purity. The Nazis used the Jews and other minorities as scapegoats. And for the students watching, a scapegoat is a person or group of people blamed for the problems of others. And so that was what happened, of course, to the Jews and to other people such as gypsies and so forth during the Nazi period. So in 1933, the Nazis came to power, and the Nazi party won the majority of the seats in the parliament, and Hitler was appointed chancellor on January 30th. As soon as that happened, they started to pass all of these laws in the parliament, and including the fact that Jewish civil servants, university professors, and school teachers were fired from their positions. Jews couldn't attend medical school, law school, those kinds of things, starting after that point in time. Now, here's an interesting thing I want you to see. It's an award that Max won, or was given, by what was called the Auto Union, and it was for driving 100,000 kilometers, which is about 62,000 miles. You'll see that's the equivalent of driving from Seattle to New York 22 times. But remember that this was in the 20s and 30s, and they didn't exactly have freeways or autobahns at that time. Now, when we did the research on this, and I showed this to Aubrey Pomerantz from the Jewish Museum in Berlin, he said he had never seen anything like this before. You'll notice the logo, which is the forerunner, of course, of the Audi logo. So we speculate that they couldn't possibly have known that Max was Jewish, because he never could have been given this award if that had been known. Now, I wanted to tell you about the little guy who was sitting there, who was Hans Lehmann. And he was my grandmother's cousin, and of course my mother's cousin and my cousin. Hans grew up in a little town that was actually bigger than Warmsen, but was called Barsinghausen, and that was about 33 miles away from their home, my mother's home in Varmson. Now, Hans went to medical school, started medical school in Germany, but quickly realized that he wasn't going to be able to continue. So he left Germany in around 1934 or so, and he went to finish his medical school training in Italy. Following that, he did not come back to Germany, but came to Seattle, where he established himself as one of the important members of the Seattle community. Hans was a cardiologist, and he enlisted in the Army Medical Corps and served in Europe for 3 years until 1945. And after 1945, he joined the faculty at the University of Washington, where he was one of the leading cardiologists. And he also served as a regent of the University of Washington between 1977 and 83. He was a philanthropist, and he was well known in the arts and the musical world. His wife there, who you see with him, is Thelma Lehman. Thelma was actually from Los Angeles, and you'll see hanging on the wall a piece of African art between them. At one time, they were the largest private collectors of African art here or in the United States. Now, Hans was instrumental, and you'll hear about how he did this in getting 20 family members out of Germany, including my mother and my grandparents. So from 1935 to 37, anti-Semitism was definitely on the rise. There were no Jews signs, and notices were posted outside of towns, villages, parks, and shops. The Nuremberg laws were passed that deprived German Jews of their citizenship, so they were enemy aliens, and Jewish students couldn't attend German schools. Aryans legally could no longer work for Jews, and so after a while, when they started to find out that my grandfather was employing non-Jews, that became a problem, and he wasn't able to do that. Now, in order for my mother to go to school, because she wasn't allowed in the schools with non-Jewish students, she had to be sent to a school in Hanover, which was about 50 miles away from Varmson, and she would have to go by herself on the train as a 13, 14-year-old girl by herself every week, where she lived in a Jewish orphanage during the week, and then would come back to their home on the weekends. Now, my grandparents were trying to figure out what was going to happen, and so they started planning for Inga's survival with the learning about the Kindertransport. The Kindertransport was a program that the British government agreed to allow unaccompanied refugee children to enter the country on temporary travel visas. Now, about 10,000 children from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia sailed to England without their parents. But unfortunately, and tragically, only a few of them ever were reunited with their parents. My grandparents registered my mother for the Kindertransport in 38, but she didn't have to go because they were able to get out of Germany the next year. So she was never in the Kindertransport, luckily for her. Kristallnacht was on November 9th, 1938. That was called the Night of the Broken Glass. And it was a Nazi organized nationwide pogrom, which was really a bunch of Nazis who were going around that night where they burned hundreds of synagogues, vandalized them. 7,500 Jewish businesses were vandalized. Jews were beaten, and more than 90 people were killed. And on that night, my grandfather was arrested along with 30,000 other Jewish men, and he was imprisoned in the Buchenwald concentration camp. Now, back in those days, in 38, you could pay what was called, quote, a fine for his release. So my grandmother was able to get him released, and this is his certificate of discharge. And you'll see that he was able to get out on November 30, 1938. So between 1938 and 1939, Max was forced to abandon his profession, though they continued to live there. In September of 1938, they registered for immigration to the United States. And at that time, Max had to, quote, sell his land to the Hanoverian Settlement Company. And it was at this time that Hans Lehmann got involved in providing affidavits for Max and my grandmother and my mother to be able to immigrate from Germany. Now, in addition to them being able to get an affidavit from Hans, Max got preferred status because he was a farm worker. And back in those days, for whatever reasons, the government was looking for farm workers to be immigrants. So that also helped in them being able to escape from Germany. And on March 30, 1939, 6 months before they left Germany, my grandfather was able to obtain an insurance policy, and that's this document that you're looking at here, to insure all of the stuff that he was sending to Seattle, which is an incredible amount of things. It included all kinds of furniture, feather beds, about a 500 book library with bookcases. He was able to bring over tools. He had place settings for 16 silver and flatware. And so somehow he was able to pack all that stuff up and it was able to be sent. I had never known how he got all of that stuff to Seattle until we found this document just recently that shows that. And that's how all of this information, how all of the things that he was able to bring here got to Seattle. And of course, Hans provided an affidavit, as I mentioned. And what was happening, to them was in stark contrast, which was happening with the Anne Franks. And most of you probably know the Anne Frank story. The Frank family moved from Germany to Amsterdam in 1933. And then the Germans occupied Holland in 1940. And Anne Frank's father, Otto, wrote letters. He was trying to get a sponsor for them to get to the United States, which was right at the same time that Hans began letter writing for the Schlonau family and others. And he received, they were able to receive visas to leave in September of 1939. But with the Franks, with no visa and no affidavits, they had to go into hiding in 1942. And we know the tragic end to that. Now here is a copy of the actual affidavit that Hans signed. You'll see that it was signed by J.H. Lehmann and signed an affidavit in support for the purpose of enabling Max Schlonau, Lenchen, that's her name in German, Helene Schlonau, and my mother Inga to leave Germany. So they were able to escape from Germany in 1939. Now, in 1933, the Jewish population in Germany was about 500,000, which was actually less than 1% of the entire German population. During the next 6 years, about 280,000 Jews fled Germany, and another 117,000 fled from Austria. And some were able to go to the United States, some to England, Central and South America, Shanghai, China, and Australia. On September 1, 1939, they were able to travel. My mom and her parents were able to travel from Germany. And of course, that's an important date in history because September 1, 1939 was the day that Germany invaded Poland. And it was the day of the first, that the war started, World War II started in Europe. So they traveled from Seattle to Rotterdam, or from Rotterdam to New York on the Stadtendam 3 ship. And there's a picture of it. And we were able to find the manifest where it shows their names, Hans, Helene, and Inga Schlonau. And that's how they got to the United States. And of course, they left from Rotterdam. They went to New York. From New York, they went on to Chicago for a short period of time, and then to Seattle to be with Hans. Now, this was a 6,000-mile journey. They had no idea of anything about Seattle. That was about it. And of course, it was as far away into the United States as you could get from where they were coming from. And, it's not just a matter of getting on a ship and taking a nice trip. Max and Helene and my mother, they had to leave everything behind, everything that had been important to them. They had to leave, come to a country, and it's not like they had the internet where they could check out Seattle and see what it looks like. They had no idea about this. They had to come to a whole new country with a different language, with different customs. This was not an easy thing for them to do, but they were lucky that they got to. Now, Hans also helped his mother and his sisters, Ruth and Lottie, also get out of Germany. Ruth came to Seattle and worked as a woman's fashion designer in about 1950. She first went to London. She met Martin Metzen, a Danish resistance fighter here in Seattle, and they were married in 1953. And Ruth and Martin and their children were, our very close relatives, along with Hans and Thelma, and also, of course, Lottie and her husband, Ruby, and their kids. We're all extremely close. And Martin, as I said, was a Danish resistance fighter. And here he'll tell you a little bit about that. Of course, Martin passed away a number of years ago, but this was an oral history, part of an oral history that was taken from him.
Not only to print the papers, but to get them distributed. So one evening, I had picked up a whole briefcase full of papers and was on my bicycle on the way home. And one of the streets, there was standing a guy by the sidewalk and says, "Careful, there's a German roadblock 2 blocks up." So I was able to turn off. There was one of the people from the underground that was standing there. So I was able to drive around the roadblock. Otherwise, if he wouldn't have been there, I would be going right into that roadblock.
You were a young man, you had a job, you had a fiance. Why did you become involved?
You had to. You were a Dane and you had to fight the Germans with the best ability.
And so here's a picture. This is at a picnic. We always had family picnics for Mother's Day, Father's Day. This picture is taken probably in around 1955 to 1957. And most of those people, with the exception of my father, who is the guy you see on the right there at the front of the picture, and next to him is Ruby, that was Lottie's husband. They and a couple others there were the only ones who weren't survivors from Germany. You see Hans and Thelma in the middle there. My grandmother is at the very back end. And we were always fortunate to that we were able to get out of Germany, that they were able to get out, and it was never, there was never ever a family gathering, which happened quite often where that wasn't discussed. And so what were they able to escape? Well, the German population in Europe was about 9.5 million in 1933. 6 million Jews and 5 million others were killed in the Holocaust. 1.1 million Jews and 200,000 others were victims, were deported, sent to Auschwitz, and of course they were exterminated. So what was life in the United States like for German refugees? From 1938 to 45, about 90,000 Jews from Nazi Germany came to the United States. Now, my grandfather tried to get some of his relatives, his sister and some other relatives, to the United States with the help of Hans. You'll see this letter that Hans wrote vouching for my grandfather, saying that he would be able to support them and take care of them. Unfortunately, none of those people were ever able to get out, and all of their relatives died. Now, by 1941, it was almost impossible to immigrate from Germany to the United States. But there were restrictions on German Jewish refugees in the 40s. The Alien Registration Act of 1940 required all foreign-born persons who are not US citizens to register with the United States Post Office. Then, on December 8, 1941, all German Jews were classified as enemy aliens. Of course, that was the day after Pearl Harbor. So they went from being enemy aliens in Germany to being enemy aliens in the United States. A curfew was imposed on German Jews. Permits were required to travel. If you had to travel more than 5 miles, you had to have a permit. And when my grandfather came to the United States, he worked at what and where they lived at first was at the Hollywood Dairy Farm in Woodinville, which you now know to be the San Michele Winery. He also worked as a landscape gardener and became very successful at that. They then moved to the south end of Seattle, where Max raised chickens, grew vegetables, flowers, fruits, and plants. Some of my fondest memories, even though I was quite very young, 4 or 5 years old, was to go get eggs every morning from the chickens. And my grandmother worked in a toy factory for a few years. And my mother graduated from high school, and Broadway High School, which is now Seattle Central College. And then she went on to Seattle College, which is now Seattle University. And
well, it looks like we've lost Steve Pruzan there. Julia, do you want to come back in?
Sure, that is too bad. Let's see if we can get Steve back in the picture. He was nearing the end of his presentation, but of course we want to be able to experience some Q&A with him and get him to finish things out. Richard, do you want to give Steve a quick call? And
Yeah, I'll do that.
Great. Thanks everyone for bearing with us. If you would just stay tuned, don't move, don't leave your Zoom screen. I'm sure that we'll bring Steve back any moment here, and I apologize. These things sometimes happen on Zoom. Let's see, what can I talk about that won't detract from Steve's presentation? I don't want to give away any part of his story, but as you can tell, his entire family, his community was so embedded when Steve was growing up about embedded in the German Jewish survivor community. I want to just briefly mention, because I was going to anyway toward the end, next week's Lunch and Learn on the 18th at noon. We hope you'll join us for that as well. We will have award-winning singer Avi Wisnia joining us. He'll share stories and songs of his grandfather, Cantor David Wisnia, and trace his grandfather's harrowing journey from being a Polish singing star in his youth to an Auschwitz prisoner and finally an American liberator. So that's going to be quite an experience. I believe one of our wonderful docents, Carl Schuthoff, is going to be hosting that Lunch and Learn. So please don't miss that one next week. I actually got a really interesting question here from Sue in the Q&A about what the round object behind me is. I'm guessing that, Sue, you're referring to this pillar, perhaps, which is in the library space of our museum here. This is a virtual background, but it's a pillar that is supposed to look like a tree. You might be able to see a few branches toward the top, and each little wooden tag on the tree has the name of a Holocaust survivor who moved to the Seattle area. So each one is different, and we do plan to add to this tree with additional names as soon as we can get a solid list of as many survivors as possible who came to this area. And of course, that's hundreds of individuals. Rich, looks like we have an update from Richard that we're unable to reach Steve at the moment. I'm just looking through the questions we've received in case any of them I can answer. They're all sort of personal questions towards Steve Pruzan, so hopefully we can get him to answer those at some other later date. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for bearing with us as we dealt with this strange disruption, but we will be able to share the questions submitted with Steve, and we can make those available. I got a question from somebody in chat asking what Dencho is, which I had mentioned in our intro. Dencho is a local Seattle organization that's devoted to saving the oral histories of folks from the Japanese American community who are incarcerated during World War II. So they do a lot of really powerful work, a lot of education, and we work with them often because of our, somewhat parallel missions. So that event I mentioned this earlier today, that's occurring on Zoom tonight at 5. I believe Richard posted the link in the chat, but it will be featuring the director of Dencho along with an author, the author of The Boys in the Boat, who recently wrote another book about Japanese American incarceration. I appreciate everybody who's added questions that we will be able to pass on to Steve. He's spent so much time researching this presentation, especially with the help of our wonderful Lori Warshall-Cohen, who works with our legacy speakers. So I just want to thank you all for being here and for your attention to Steve's family story. Before we finish up here and we would conclude the program, just a reminder that the views, information, and opinions expressed in our Lunch and Learns are solely those of the individuals involved, do not necessarily represent those of the Holocaust Center for Humanity.
Sorry, I lost you there for a minute.
Oh, Steve, oh my gosh, I'm so glad to see you. We were just about to actually finish up. I was filling the airspace with some ramblings, but I really appreciate that you're back. So
I hit the wrong button. I apologize.
you know what? It happens to the best of us. So we did have a lot of really great questions. We were pretty close to the end of your slides. So would you be okay with just jumping into questions at this point?
Yeah, no, I had finished my slides.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. So let's do this. Thanks everyone who stuck with us. This is awesome. Okay, so we did get a question from Emily who asked if you could expand on how the Jewish Museum in Berlin helped your research, and do they still do such a thing to your knowledge?
Yes, they still go around looking for obituaries from German Jews who were able to escape. They have a huge archive. The Jewish Museum in Berlin is a very large structure that just in the last year or so has been totally remodeled, and it's now reopened. But they have archives with hundreds, if not thousands, of these kinds of things, and they're all kept in, special vaults that are properly air conditioned and so forth to maintain the documents. And so, yeah, you can. They're still doing that, and the Jewish Museum in Berlin is one of the great museums to go visit.
Great, thank you, Steve. This is a really great question from Shira, who writes, could you elaborate on how religious your family was in Germany and how that played out in Seattle?
Sure. My family has been Reformed Jews since they were in Germany. They're not Orthodox Jews, they were Reformed Jews. Reformed Judaism began in Germany, and they were observant Reformed Jews in Germany. And when they came to Seattle, they joined Temple de Hirsch Sinai, and that became a very important part of our lives. I went even as a 2-3-year-old with my grandmother, with her to the temple when she would sing in the ladies' choir. She supported me through a lot of things that I did at the temple, and subsequently, and at the time back then, we every Friday night we observed Shabbat and had dinner at my grandparents' house. And I ended up becoming very active in the temple, became a temple president back in the early 90s, and am active nationally and internationally in the Reform movement. I'm on the Board of Governors of the Hebrew Union College and on the board of the Union for Reform Judaism. So that became a very important part of my life, and that all started through my grandparents and from Germany and when they came to Seattle.
Great, thank you for sharing that. A great question here about the German language. Did your mother or grandparents ever speak German to you, or did you ever have the chance to study that language?
Well, that's a great question. what happened was that, yes, my mother and my grandmother, of course, my grandfather, but he died when I was 6, but they kind of spoke in their own language. It was sort of half English and half German, but they did speak German a lot. And the phenomenon of this is that, my dad was not German. Of course, he was born here in Seattle in 1922. And his family had come from Lithuania around 1900 or so. But in any event, what happened was that in families where there were 2 German-speaking parents, the kids learned German. When there was 1 German speaker and 1 English speaker, it didn't happen. So unfortunately, I never did learn German.
Mm. Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. If your own parents couldn't speak German to each other, of course, you wouldn't be hearing it at home much. I also am remembering I took 1 quarter of German, just 1, but we would refer to a mixture of English and German as Deutsch, like Deutsch and English. Just had to pop that in there. Someone is asking about Hans Lehmann. Did he and his wife have any kids?
Yes, they have 2 kids, Spencer and Mark. Spence died a few years ago, and Mark lives up in the Bellingham area.
And also Martin Metzen, another very fascinating figure that was a part of your family's, your extended family. Can you tell us a little bit more about him? Did you know him personally?
Yeah, we were very close. All of our families were very close. So we would see Martin, and to this day, I see his kids all the time, and we all get together and carry on our family traditions. And Martin came to the United States around 1950, having been born in Denmark, of course, in the Danish resistance. He brought with him a son, Jorgen, who I'm very close with, when he came from Denmark, and then married into our family, married Ruth as I mentioned, in 1953. Martin became a CPA and was a very prominent CPA. He then also was very active in the Danish community and was the Danish consulate here in Seattle for many, many years. He also was involved religiously and was one of the founders of Temple Beth Am, which is in the north part of Seattle.
Sounds like he was quite a force. In all the photos I've seen of him, he looks quite dashing somehow. And we do have a few artifacts on display here at the center if you're ever able to visit. This is for our attendees from Martin. There's an armband from his Danish resistance time and another document that are in our display cases. Okay, I think we have time for at least 1 more question, Steve. Someone wants to know, I think this is a really important question. Did you hear a lot about your family's past when you were growing up? What was the conversation like around those experiences?
Yeah, we did. I mean, we would always get together for the holidays, like Thanksgiving. We always, like the one picture I showed of a picnic. We were together, as family, many times a year. And the conversation always came around to what happened in Germany, how lucky we were to be in the United States and had been able to get here in the way that I've described. There was always speeches. People in our family loved to give speeches, and they were always giving speeches about something political or you know, and of course they also loved to fight with each other about these things. So there was always a lot of robust conversation in the family. And so, yes, we as kids heard about this on a very, very regular basis.
Great, thanks, Steve. One more question. Did your mom or your grandparents ever return to Varmson? Did they visit? What was their ongoing relationship like with Germany?
So my grandmother went back to Varmson a couple of different times. And then, as I think I mentioned in my presentation, my parents and my sister and I went to Varmson. That's where we met the lady who was my mother's nanny, and went around that day. And that was really, like I was mentioning, quite an emotional experience. And I was thinking about that this morning again, and realized it's really hard to imagine that it was 50 years ago that we went there. I had just graduated from college. My sister had graduated from high school, and it was my parents' 25th wedding anniversary. And
Wow.
so we went to Europe for 4 or 5 weeks. And interestingly enough, we ended the trip in Denmark, where we met, where the whole family gathered, Hans and Thelma and Ruth and Lottie, and we celebrated Martin's mother's 80th birthday.
Wow.
So we got to experience Denmark with them, and that was a great experience.
Sounds like it must have been very special. Well, Steve, I thank you so much for joining us on Zoom today and sharing your family's story. Thank you for returning after we got cut off briefly.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. I meant
don't worry about it.
Unshare my screen, and I hit a wrong button, but hopefully it didn't create too much of a problem.
It is perfectly fine. As I mentioned a little while ago, the recording of this talk will be on our website starting tomorrow, so you can reference it or watch again. And Steve, I just again want to thank you for your time, and I'll see you soon. So
thank you.
Sure. That concludes our program today, everyone. Stay safe and be well. Bye.
Bye.